Cole was our literacy professor. Are we good to go? Ira Litt is the director of Step Elementary. He worked at Bank Street for a while.
Okay, I don't know.
Okay, he's one of these rock star professor type people. He's the director of the program. He has a job that's like Elisa's job for DTE. I mean, undergrad I studied political theory, so I worked with Rob Reich, not your guys' Robert Reich, right? But the philosopher at Stanford. So I did a fair amount of work with him. Yeah.
Cool.
I also took a fair amount of math, but like most undergraduate math courses, like all the way up through like, partial differential equations, right? The classes were taught by PhD students, right? And some of them were quite excellent teachers, and some of them were okay, right? They had strong content knowledge, but not strong pedagogical content knowledge.
It varies substantially.
Yeah.
When I got to Stanford, they told me 2 weeks before the beginning of the semester what I'd be teaching, handed me a book and said, good luck. And it was interesting at that time. That was just before the beginning of the Vietnam War. There were a lot of student protests, and among the protests was the student claim that the teaching in the math department was the worst in the university. And the department took it seriously, and they actually started TA training programs. I don't know that it was ever possible to reform the faculty.
Well, there was the big campaign for undergraduate research and teaching, right?
Yeah,
and that really
changed.
pushed out a lot of people who were scholars first and teachers second, right?
Yeah, I mean, I get the Stanford Alumni magazine.
Sure.
It's very clear that Hennessy has really been serious about undergraduate education. It's a good thing.
Yeah.
Okay, you two are on. So
Okay,
you're ready?
great.
Go for it.
Let's go ahead and get started.
So let me take a swig of water and then we'll get started.
Great.
So. I think because my nose is stuffed, I will also take care of that before
Okay.
we get started. Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Alan Schoenfeld. I'm a professor at Cal, and for as long as I can remember, I've been studying mathematical thinking, problem solving, and teaching. And I'm really interested in what makes for powerful mathematics classrooms, which means classrooms that produce students who are not only good mathematical thinkers, but have positive mathematical identities, think of themselves as people who are good at mathematics. And sorry. The research that I've been doing for the past half dozen years or so says that powerful mathematics classrooms share certain attributes, and that if these things happen in those classrooms, then the kids will emerge from them powerful thinkers. So I'm going to say a little bit about them, then I'm going to ask you about you and your students, and then we'll turn to your plans for today, and I'll use the framework that I'm about to describe in order to frame our conversation. So if you're going to talk about a math classroom, even a kindergarten classroom, the first thing that you want to talk about is the quality of the mathematics. And the key thing about the Common Core standards, and there are specific standards, there are mathematical practices. If I were to sum it up in a phrase, it's about having kids become mathematical sense makers, having them engage in mathematics in ways that they see how it comes together, so it's not a set of arbitrary rules, but something they can make sense of. And then, if they can make sense of it, they develop a sense of themselves as productive mathematical thinkers. They develop positive mathematical dispositions. They develop the practices, which are, at the beginning, being problem solvers, being able to grapple with and persevere with problems, being thinkers, being able to reason in coherent ways, understand the reasoning of others. So being good thinkers, listeners, reasoners, problem solvers, and sense makers. That's the bottom line. So that's the mathematics. But as I don't have to tell you, as any teacher will tell me, there's the whole kid. There's all sorts of other stuff that's going on, both about learning and about identity. About learning, what we know is that spoon feeding kids little facts, little bits and pieces, isn't productive, both because they're all hard to remember and because they don't fit together. Leaving the kids at sea to do discovery also doesn't work. It's too open. There's a happy middle ground where kids have enough structure and enough support so that they can engage in what we call productive struggle. And one question that I'll be asking you then is, how are you thinking about productive struggle as it plays out in your classroom?
Yeah.
Okay. The second dimension of the framework, no, it's the third dimension of the framework. The third dimension has to do with equity and access. The question inside the classroom is, does every kid have an opportunity to engage with the mathematics in a way that's reasonable for that kid? Can the kid sink his or her teeth into the mathematics? Are there opportunities so that every single child in the classroom can engage in ways that are meaningful? And for the teacher, the question then is, how are you thinking about providing such opportunities for your class, given that they're obviously diverse? A colleague of mine once said, there is no such thing as a fifth grade classroom or a kindergarten classroom, because you've got kids who are all over the place in terms of what they know, whether they're ELA students or native speakers. So one major question is how you think about making the content accessible to all of those students so they can all get engaged. The next dimension, which I've already mentioned by way of introduction, is technically called agency, authority, and identity. It has to do with how the students see themselves as learners, see themselves as thinkers, see themselves as doers of mathematics. Do they see themselves as people who, when confronted with a mathematics problem, can stand up to it, can engage in problem solving because they have the confidence and the sense of self that enables them to say, I can do this kind of thing. And the last dimension is the uses of assessment, particularly formative assessment. Teaching works really well, learning works really well when the teacher knows what the kids know and arranges instruction so that it meets the kids where they are and helps move them forward. So I'll also be asking you about the ways in which you think about productively assessing your kids so you can help them learn. Well, let's start at the beginning.
Great.
Why don't you tell me about yourself and what brought you to Lighthouse?
Sure. My name is Robbie Torney, and I'm a kindergarten teacher here at Lighthouse Community Charter School in East Oakland, California. I'm tremendously lucky to teach at Lighthouse. Lighthouse is an urban school that serves a predominantly low-income student population. We do it in a really special way. Lighthouse is a school that's set up first and foremost to know children, to know their families, to know them for a long time, to be a presence in the community, and to be a school that's really thinking about people, right? The kids in our classroom and their families as people first, not test scores, right? Not other external measures, right? We're here for our families first, and that's so clear in our school design and in our mission. And high quality, rigorous academics is a key part of that. It's absolutely a non-negotiable for us here at Lighthouse, but it's not the only thing, right? And there are so many schools that treat high quality academics or rigorous instruction as the only thing, to the tremendous detriment of the students that we serve. I think the last thing I'll say about Lighthouse is that there are many urban schools where teachers who teach there wouldn't send their own children. Lighthouse is the kind of school where many of my colleagues do send their own children, and I would send my own children as well.
Cool. Can you tell me something about the students we'll be seeing today?
Sure. The students that you're going to be seeing today are kindergartners. The majority of them are from Spanish-speaking families. The majority of them receive free and reduced price lunch. It's right at the very end of the school year, so the kindergartners have had an entire year to know each other and to know me and to know the other adults in the room. This is a learning community that they're familiar with. This is a learning community with familiar rituals and routines and expectations. This is a learning community that's been shaped by every child. So to that extent, it's going to look different than what you would see if you came in on the second day of school or the third day of school.
I think I'll go to the mathematics. So I was trying to think of whether I'd go ahead to the
Yeah,
community.
that's fine. We'll come back to that.
Yeah. So why don't you tell me about the mathematical activity you have planned for today?
Okay. I want to talk about the mathematical activity that we're doing today as part of a sequence, and I want to contextualize what we're doing within the larger progression of learning that students need to do in operations and algebraic thinking, K through 2 or even K through 5.
Great.
So the students today are going to be working with a task that's asking them to find how many more you're going to need to get to 10, right? So if I say you have 8, how many more do you need to get to 10? You as a fluent mathematician know that you need 2 more to get to 10. This is a kind of tricky understanding for kindergartners, and the way that I've approached this is by I'm getting into it through a decomposition context. In the previous lessons in this sequence, students have been working on decomposing 10 in different ways and talking about, well, if you know that 10 is the same as 2 plus 8, what does the 2 mean? Where is that visually in the tools that we've been using? We've been looking at playing cards, right? If you circle a group of 2, how does that numeral 2 correlate with the quantity on the card? Where does the numeral 8 correlate with the quantity on the card? Is that truly the same if the 2 and the 8 are in visually different positions, right? That's the work that the students have been grappling with in the lesson that's been leading up to this. Today, I'm going to remind the students of the decomposition context that they worked with last time. We're actually going to be looking at some of the work that they generated to activate that knowledge or that experience. And then I'm simply going to ask them, I'm going to present them with different sets of objects from 1 to 9 and ask them how many more they think they're going to need to get to 10, right? So, to contextualize that within the broader work that students are doing in K2 operations and algebraic thinking, this is really important because as the students move on in their math experience to first grade and second grade and so forth, they're going to be asked to solve addition and subtraction problems in ways that require them to be able to break apart numbers or to find friendly numbers that are easy to work with, right? And this kind of experience where students are asked to grapple with that and to really figure out, well, why is it that when I have 9 hearts, I need 1 more to get to 10? Or why is it when I have 8 hearts, I need 2 more to get to 10? And to start to make sense of the pattern and the repeated reasoning there, that's the work that's going to support them in being able to solve addition and subtraction problems in the upper grades.
That makes a lot of sense given the goals of the curriculum, which are to have fluency so that, well, I could do it symbolically or numerically.
Yeah.
If you know that A plus B equals C, then you also know that A equals C minus B and that B equals C minus A. Or with numbers, if you know that 3 plus 7 equals 10, then it's automatic that 3 is 10 minus 7, that 7 is 10 minus 3, and so on. and that you can move back and forth between them.
Can I say one thing about that quickly? I think it's really interesting that you identified that as a key fluency, and that is in fact a key fluency for first grade students under the Common Core state standards. My kindergartners are really engaged with what you just described, that understanding of the relationship between the addends, between the parts and the whole, at a conceptual level still, right? They have that fluency with addition and subtraction within 5. They can really do that very, very quickly and automatically by this time of the year. This kind of experience is going to help them develop that particular fluency so that it becomes a fluency, right? We're still at the level of conceptual understanding.
Yeah, well, these things take time both at the level of conceptual understanding and at the level of fluency, and there's a give and take between the two. And there's a literature that says if you watch kids learning to count from the very beginning, and you ask them, what's 3 plus 5? Well, they may have to put out 3 items, 5 items, and go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Yep.
A little bit later, they'll realize, I don't have to count the 3. I can go 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. A little bit later, they'll go, why not start with the larger one that's easier, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then as they're developing those kinds of understandings, which will come naturally, but can also be supported by instruction, they're also beginning to develop the kinds of fluencies. The thing that says, oh, I can add first this and then that, or I can start with these and then that. And then when it gets to more complicated things like A plus B equals C, they have the experiential foundation, and then it's a question of giving them enough both contextual surround and practice so that some of it becomes more automatic.
Yeah.
That's cool. I'm glad you're thinking long term. One of the things the authors of the Common Core standards really tried to work on was the notion of progression, so that as they looked at the entire curriculum, they said, let's focus on the things that move the students forward. First whole number, then rational number, but not just fractions in general. Think about the parts of ratio that lead to linear functions and things like that. So having a sense of the grade span and where your kids are going is really important.
Sure, and I think that speaks to what you were saying earlier about making sure that these learning experiences aren't just bits and pieces of information that are being given to students, right? That they fit into a coherent learning progression that's going somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's turn to the other dimensions.
Sure.
Let's think about cognitive demand or productive struggle. I have a feeling we'll see that very clearly, but how are you thinking about that in terms of your own students?
Yeah. I think I want to talk about productive struggle. I've heard it referred to as constructive struggle before. I think it may be a similar term. I want to talk about that at 2 levels. The first is related to the culture of mathematics in the classroom and the culture of learning more generally. In order for students to constructively struggle, they have to feel safe. They have to feel known with one another. They have to know the other people in the classroom. There have to be predictable ways that we interact with each other. There also has to be the expectation that when something's hard for us, we keep going, right? And I think that there's been a lot of recent discussion or sort of hype around soft skills in learning, and I think that that just understands what we know to be true, right? And that we need to make it explicit for students that when things are hard for them, like their brains are growing, right? Like they are developing, and that struggle is part of learning. And when we struggle and when we exercise our brain, right, our brains get stronger and we learn things, right? So that expectation that school isn't going to be always easy, it's not always going to be just getting the right answer, that we're not going to just give up when something's hard for us, that has to be foundational in the classroom, and that's something that the teacher and the students and the members of the learning community can put in place. And that piece has to be there. I think the second piece that I think a lot about with constructive struggle is task design. What is a task, a mathematical task that is at the appropriate level of rigor that allows all students to engage in the kind of mathematical thinking that we want them to engage in. Sorry. Good morning, Emily. I'll go ahead and repeat that. So I'm thinking a lot about task design as a way to encourage constructive struggle, that so that every student in the class can engage with the same type of mathematical thinking. And what you're going to see in terms of this task design today is that there are going to be lots of very small problems that students are going to be engaging with. Some students
That's going to be our unit.
I can tell your Stanford background.
Why?
Oh, Carol Dweck and growth mindset. Liz Cohn and group-worthy problems. But I'm very glad to have you saying this. It's just.
Okay, we'll set it there. Yeah,
Honestly, I think
that's
it
fine.
should be okay.
Okay, we're good to go? Whoops, sorry.
You put it right.
Okay, I'll sit forward a little bit so I don't bump it.
Sweet.
Yeah. So another way that you can, I'm thinking about constructive struggle as in task design. I'm thinking about a task that every,
Second, sorry. Are you sitting back?
I was sitting back.
Oh yeah, yeah. If you could do that.
Okay, then let me just go ahead. That would be great because I'm just, I move around when I'm talking. Sorry. Perfect, thank you. All right, we're finally going to talk about task design.
Tell me about task design.
Are we good?
Not yet.
Not yet.
He sits back because then he monitors sound.
Sorry, I'm worried that your mic's going to pick up my stomach growling. I did have breakfast, but
No, mine's doing the same thing.
yeah.
Welcome
Like,
to the
I
club.
have to,
Okay, so we are set.
Okay. So another way that we can think about constructive struggle is by thinking about a task that every child in the class can access. Today, one of the important elements of task design that you're going to see is that every child is going to be approaching a small problem. Some children may spend the entire time today working with one problem. Other children may spend more time doing more problems, right? They may accomplish more content over the same amount of time. I think the key thing that I'm thinking about is that the thinking is going to be the same for every child. You spoke a little bit earlier about children's counting development and the way that they're starting to think about composing and decomposing numbers. I think that you will absolutely see that today. Some students are going to be using fingers and other representations to help them figure out how many more they need to make 10. And I think that you'll see that the task itself is encouraging students to use those different approaches to do what they need to do to make sense of this task. And to that extent, I think one of the most important pieces that you'll see instructionally is that I'm not going to be suggesting to my students that they approach this in any one particular way. We are going to spend time at the beginning talking and generating some ideas and having some language around what we're doing and what this task is. What is it to make 10? How does it relate to decomposing 10, which we just did? Maybe some students aren't necessarily going to understand or go to independent practice with an understanding that the decomposition and the composition context are linked. But by doing it, they will get there, right? And maybe it's not going to happen today for everybody. But I think that this sort of messy, like open-ended sense-making with some structure, right? With talk and me knowing what students are doing, right? Can help everybody progress in a way that is optimal for them, right? So that they're constructively struggling. And I think that starts with me being open to students approaching tasks in the way that they should approach them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I heard you talk about growth mindset, the notion that kids come to understand mind is like a muscle. You use it, it gets stronger.
Right.
I heard you talk about um, the richness of mathematical tasks, the idea being that a really rich tasks allows lots of kids different ways into it.
Mm-hmm.
So that means more kids can get engaged in ways that are meaningful to them. And then earlier, I just want to have you say a little bit more. You mentioned the idea of safety for your kids.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you can say a bit more about that, because in many math classes, it's scary to get a wrong answer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, again, this is not, when you're thinking about an environment in which it's safe to think and to take risks, this is not something that's true just for math. This is true for any learning experience. If I'm a student sitting in a classroom and I know my teacher is going to be like, no, that's wrong, right? Or if I'm going to say something that is maybe incorrect and my friend is going to be like, that's wrong, right? I'm really going to shut down, and I'm maybe not even going to engage in that thinking, right? I think that this idea of safety and this idea of like of students being worried about being incorrect maybe comes out of misplaced priorities for a long time. One of the pieces of the Common Core that I'm really excited about are the mathematical practice standards. And as you spoke about earlier, the opportunity for students to make sense of mathematics. And when you're thinking about making sense of mathematics, the answer that you come to is absolutely vital. You have to have precision there. You have to get the correct answer, right? But there's also this piece about process, right? And as you're engaged in the process of coming to those correct answers, mathematicians fail, right? They make mistakes. They learn from that, right? They revise their thinking. Like, these are things that mathematicians of all ages do. And that has to be built into the way that we do math, right? So that if you fail or if you struggle, right, or if you have a incomplete understanding of something, that you're willing to share that and revise it, right, or defend it if you're in the place to defend it. But there's the space in the community for students to elevate their thinking without being worried about how that thinking is being evaluated by their peers or by their teachers.
Let me ask a related question.
Sure.
Which is about collaboration and building on each other's ideas. How do you think about that? How do you think about group work in the class?
Sure.
Anything you care to say?
Yeah. I think that one of the things that I saw in the lesson that we filmed earlier this week, and one of the things that I'm hoping we'll see again today, is an environment in which students are actually really engaged in talking about their thinking with other people at their tables. In the lesson today, I think that you will see that students are seeing the other mathematicians at their tables as resources, as people to talk to, right? People who are just as valuable to talk to as the teacher, right? People that they can go to if they have questions or if they need help or if they just want to share their thinking, right? You're not necessarily going to see students working on the same task. And I think that is related to this idea of students being able to approach the task at the level that's appropriate for them, or at the access point that's appropriate for them. And I think one of the dangers of group work sometimes, is that students don't necessarily get the opportunity to engage in the thinking themselves, right? And that's not always the case. There are absolutely times where students do need to be collaborating around a particular math task or a particular math project, and there's real value there. Today, you're going to see students working somewhat independently of one another, but talking about the learning that they're doing with the other people at their table.
Okay, so you've addressed a number of the questions that I actually have about dimensions 3 and 4, but I just want to make it explicit since that's the language we're using. We okay on time?
Yeah, we're okay on time.
Okay. In talking about the ways that there are multiple ways to do the tasks, and your students have many ways in, you really address the issue of access for all, constructing an environment in which every kid can be engaged in appropriate mathematical activities, growth activities, in the way you're talking about them. The comment you made about the potential for kids to be shut down either by the teacher or by other students are one side of the coin. The flip side of the coin in terms of developing agency, developing a positive mathematical identity, is having the ability to speak mathematics, get recognized as someone who can do mathematics, see yourself as a mathematical sense maker. And it sounds like you've structured some of the group interactions so that both your interventions and the kids' conversations with each other give them an opportunity to develop those kinds of positive mathematical identities.
Yes. I would also highlight, in addition to that, during the way that the lesson is going to be structured today is that there's going to be an introducing or an opening phase where we are talking about a really cool math problem, right? Hey, we decomposed 10 yesterday. We decomposed it into 9 and 1. That's how Maria did it. I have 9 hearts here on this card. How many more would I need to get to 10? Like, how do you think we can solve this problem, right? We're just going to talk about it. And in that, and then the students are going to go off to their tables, and then we're going to come back at the end, and we're going to summarize some of the learning we did, again, through conversation. I think in those whole group conversations, we as teachers have the opportunity to have all students see that they have something to learn from everybody, and in doing so, we can elevate students' mathematical identities. 2 students that I want you to be looking out for today are my friends Monse and Isabel. These are students who maybe at the beginning of the year would have come in and not necessarily, if you had asked them if they liked math or if they thought of themselves as mathematicians, they might have said no, right? Or they might have had no opinion about it. The way that these students have shared their thinking or continue to share their thinking or see themselves as people who are engaged as productive mathematicians who are having productive discourse with other students is incredible. And I don't think that given how these students present themselves and how they talk about their mathematical ideas, that you would identify that these are students who sometimes struggle with certain elements of math, especially as related to number, right? So I think what I'm trying to say is that we have the opportunity to create environments where equitable access for math includes the idea that I have something, like I, the teacher, and you, the student who really thinks that they understand this concept, has something to understand from learning about the way that somebody else is approaching a problem or an idea or a concept.
Right. I'll also just note in passing that you've identified a particular student and her idea that's going to be named, and that's saying to the class, this person has something of mathematical value that's worth sharing.
Sure.
Which is an important part of identity building.
Yeah.
So let's go to the last dimension, which you've addressed tacitly in a whole bunch of ways,
Sure.
which is formative assessment. How do you think about knowing what's going on in your kids' heads, meeting where they are, especially given that you've got so many of them?
Yeah. I think that the most powerful go-to tool that I have for knowing what my students know is their work. And I say that work doesn't always represent what's going on in students' heads, but if you structure a task in a way that requires students to record their thinking in particular ways, I can get glimpses into what students are understanding about different mathematical ideas. So I'll give you a for instance, and then I'll back up and we can talk about this more broadly so I don't get lost in my thoughts. When you look at the model work that I'm presenting today, a decomposition of 10 as 9 and 1, one of the things you'll notice is that on each of the hearts that Maria has decomposed, in the 10 hearts that Maria has decomposed into 2 groups, a group of 9 and a group of 1, there's a marker dot on each heart. And what that's indicating to me is that Maria, at some level, is still checking to make sure that the total of the hearts is still 10. She knows she has a group of 9. She knows she has a group of 1, right? on every single one of her papers, regardless of the decomposition, whether it's 5 and 5, or whether it's 4 and 6, or whether it's 3 and 7, right? She's still checking to make sure that it's 10 every single time. And that tells me a little bit that tells me about where she is in her understanding of addition in particular, right? And I could tell you things like that about all of the work that my students have produced for this particular lesson and for lessons that I've taught more generally. I think that if we as teachers design tasks and the work that students are going to be doing to reflect actual mathematical thinking and not just sort of like rote like recording for the sake of recording or draw a picture for the sake of drawing a picture, we can glean deep understandings of what our students are thinking about and knowing about mathematical content. So analysis of student work, looking deeply at work and setting aside the time to look at work and to collaborate with colleagues and to take a look at student work, that's like the most powerful tool that I have. A secondary tool, of course, is conversation, right? Individual conversations that I will be having with students at tables today, whole group conversations and ideas that are surfaced in whole group conversations. Those are checks for understanding that will help me think about how students are understanding a concept or approaching a concept, right? For instance, in the opening discussion today, if students are not surfacing the idea in the whole group that there is a relationship between composing 10, finding the missing number to make 10, and decomposing 10 on the previous day, if nobody is surfacing that idea, right, we're still going to go ahead and try composing 10, right? And we're still going to come back and talk in the closing phase of the lesson, in the summarizing phase, about what we learned and to ask that question again. That helps me, though, orient to the way in which I'm going to be supporting students at tables, right? Which is going to be really pushing people to make that connection. If that connection is surfaced, right, and particular students notice that there's a similarity between the way we composed 10 as a class at the beginning of the lesson and the way that somebody decomposed 10 last time, then the way that I am approaching the independent work time, especially with the students who are starting to surface that understanding, looks different. I'm going to be pushing them to apply that understanding and to really take it to a deeper level of meaning and understanding. So student talk is another huge formative assessment piece.
Yeah, I'd like to I'd like to run with that a bit because I'd also like to clear my throat. I'd like to run with that a bit because student talk has been a recurrent theme in my conversations with teachers. When I went to school, the only time you got to talk in math class was to give the answer. The teacher fired off a series of rapid fire questions in which you just got to say a few things. If you didn't have the answer, the teacher just turned to someone else. And that had two real problems. One is the math was carved into itty bitty pieces, and the other is that you never really had a chance to do the kind of explaining of your own thinking, public explaining of your own thinking that built productive mathematical identities. We know now that having that part of learning the math is learning to explain it, and in the process of explaining it, you both make it more robust for yourself and you begin to develop a more productive identity for yourself as someone who can do mathematics. But it's also scary for teachers, in that a classroom in which you maintain control and your kids only say bite-sized pieces that then you can elaborate means that you're in control of the math. The teacher has to be a risk taker too. If the teacher says, tell me about your thinking, who knows what's going to happen? How do you deal with those kinds of things? I wonder if you just talk about that in general.
Yeah, that idea that students have something to learn from each other is really at the core of this. And I also think that when we're thinking about student talk and giving students control of the classroom, that raises really fundamental questions about who is the primary teacher in the classroom and what the teacher's doing, right? I think that in sort of a really traditional sense, when I was trained as a math teacher, and that wasn't that long ago, right? The way that I was taught to teach math was through direct instruction, right? I will model something, you will try it in a sort of guided way, I'll release you to do it, right? We'll come back together and I'll see if you did it. Direct instruction is shown by research to be pretty effective at some things, right? What the direct instruction, what that sort of I think that maybe you might call that spoon feeding. And I think that there are times where students do need direct instruction, particularly around matters of mathematical convention, right? Like I just have to teach you how to use the plus sign. That being said, that model implicitly assumes that I am the person with the mathematical content and ideas. I will say it, I will assess to see whether you understood it, you will try it, you will do it my way, right? I think that what you will see today is not that kind of lesson. I'm going to really be presenting a problem and stepping to the side. And I'm going to be facilitating to mitigate, or mitigate's the wrong word, to help provide some of that structure, right? Because if there's just a free-for-all conversation with no focus, that's not going to help students learn, right? So there's a balance there that needs to happen where I present a task, I get out of the way, I facilitate to help student understanding come out. But in that model, the mathematical ideas, the important mathematical content, that's not coming from me, that's coming from the students, right? And in that way, they are given the opportunity to generate those robust mathematical concepts and ideas. And it's really cool to see students learn that way, right? Is it harder to teach that way? Is it a little bit scarier? I guess maybe sometimes, right? I think when you see students engaged in the kind of learning that comes out of a lesson that's really driven by student talk and student ideas, though, you can't really go back and teach the other way.
I agree with you. I said almost that verbatim yesterday. Let me ask two questions about potential misinterpretations
Sure.
of what you said.
Sure.
One is you said the mathematics is coming from the kids. Does that mean you're conceding mathematical authority and whatever says goes in the classroom?
No.
Okay, say more.
Okay, I'll say more. So this goes back to what I talked about earlier with a lot of different, with the classroom culture and the design of math tasks and how students are engaged in talking with each other, right? And the ways in which their mathematical identities are developed. There's lots of work that goes on and intentionality that I put into any mathematical conversation to make sure that the work that students are doing is explicitly linked to things that I know they already know about mathematics, right? So in the case that you're going to see today, I have some very strong evidence from student work and from student conversations on Monday that students understand how to decompose numbers. Every single child in the class decomposed 10 in at least 2 different ways, right? That piece is the foundation for the new understanding that I'm pushing students towards today. So I think in that sense, the linkage there is preventing this from being sort of a random, like, you do what you want, what you say goes. It's okay to have a wrong answer, right? Like, I'm going to let you say that 2 + 2 is 5, right? That's not true, right? Part of doing math in this classroom is that we are precise and that we push each other to make sure that our ideas are precise and correct, right? In terms of process, though, right? Once I have that foundation and I have the assessment evidence to indicate where students are, and the students know how to communicate with each other, and I have a task that's going to allow them to constructively struggle, that's the stage at which I step back a little bit and am a facilitator, right? because the conditions are right for students to be appropriately supported. In a classroom where students are floundering, in a classroom where whatever students say goes, right, and the teacher doesn't have mathematical authority, right? I think the issue there is not that the teacher doesn't have mathematical authority, but there is no mathematical authority in the classroom, right? There's so much that goes into making sure that the work that students do is real mathematics. And I would say the kind of classroom you just proposed to me as a sort of possible misinterpretation, I would say that we all know that that's not the kind of classroom that is going to help students productively engage in math.
Great. That helps on that one. Let me turn
Sure.
to the second policy section, which is the notion that this is discovery math, and we can't expect kids to discover all of math. It's taken 2,000 years. So what do you do if they don't come up with what you'd hope they'd come up with?
Well, there are many places where I can push ideas or provide content. I think one of the things I heard you talking about earlier is this idea of counting on versus counting all, right? A child has 3 plus 5. Early on in the year, they're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Wait, what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. They're going to count all the fingers, right? You can, as a teacher, start encouraging, like, you can be like, oh, I noticed that Danielle said he counted like this, 5, 6, 7, 8. What do we think about that? Why can he do that? How does he know, right? And there are opportunities there to be elevating the things that students are doing for their peers so that other people can start trying them on. So that's one small piece of it. I also think that with this misconception around discovery math, there are many things that we as teachers have to provide for students. There are an equal, and I would actually argue a greater number of things that we have to allow students to have a mathematical experience around so that they can attach that experience to the mathematical concept and then take it down the road, right? And I think that the lesson that you're going to see today is a perfect example of that. We talked a little bit earlier about how down the road this generalizes to A plus B equals C. You also know that C minus B equals A, right? There's a reason why these standards are the operation and algebraic thinking standards. If students do not have the opportunity to discover these fundamental mathematical relationships that exist between addition and subtraction and are implicit in composing and decomposing numbers, and attach those to something special about the number 10 in our base 10 counting system, later on down the road, those holes are going to prevent them from having full mathematical understanding. So I think that this really gets to access, right? Students need the time and the space to explore and grapple and do constructive struggle to understand. As the teacher, my job is to push them, right? Like, I absolutely care about whether or not my students are mathematically proficient by the end of the year, and I have a bar that I'm pushing them towards, right? And I will do everything that I can to make sure that students are developing their mathematical thinking by providing strategies, by providing inputs, right? By talking to them, by doing some modeling, right? By suggesting that they use different math tools, right? I have a lot of things at my disposal. I'm not just going to let my students blindly explore.
That's great. Thank you. I went off script in part because you were saying such interesting things. I just wanted to have you say more. That was terrific.
Thank you so much. All right.